You ever wake up to find your driveway gone and a community path in its place? Like it got Thanos snapped into HOA heaven, because that's how my Tuesday started. Asphalt right through my ranch, a sign banning tractors, and Debbie, the clipboard queen, smiling like she just won HOA Olympics. She thought I'd roll over. Instead, I rolled out 3 diesel legends that haven't lost a fight since 1962 ever dealt with a HOA that confused authority with ownership. This one went too far, and I brought backup. With exhaust pipes, comment where you're watching from. If you've ever dreamed of legally parking chaos on someone's bad idea, the morning started normal enough. I woke up at 5:30, like always, made my coffee, and settled into my home office to start another day of remote engineering work. That's when I heard the rumbling outside. At first I thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear as crystal. The sound was coming from my driveway, or what used to be my driveway, through the kitchen window. I watched in disbelief as 3 workers in orange vests finished laying the last section of fresh black asphalt where my grandfather's dirt road had been for 40 years. The smell of hot tar filled the morning air, and steam rose from the surface, like heat waves off summer pavement. My dirt road, the same one my grandfather had built with his own hands when he bought this 5-acre ranch back in 1987, was gone. In its place lay a perfectly smooth jogging path that cut through my property like a black scar. Debbie Ruston stood supervising the operation. Like some kind of construction general, she wore a navy blazer that had seen better days, probably bought at a thrift store, with a laminated name tag that read, "Our President," in bold letters. Her pink clipboard never left her hand, and those reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose made her look like she was trying way too hard to appear official. She had this aluminum pointing stick that she waved around, directing the workers, acting like she owned the place. When she saw me watching from the window, her smile got even wider, and she actually waved at me like we were old friends. That woman had some serious nerve, I'll give her that much. I threw on my grandfather's old John Deere cap and walked outside to confront this madness. "Excuse me, what exactly is going on here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. Debbie consulted her clipboard like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Mr. Hayes, according to HOA Resolution 2024-07, your ranch property now falls under community jurisdiction," she announced, with the authority of someone who'd clearly practiced this speech. "This driveway improvement is part of our neighborhood beautification initiative." The workers kept laying asphalt while she talked, acting like this was the most normal thing in the world. I could feel my grandfather's spirit rolling over in his grave. "I never agreed to any HOE jurisdiction," I said, my hands clenching into fists inside my jacket pockets. "This is private property and you have no right to pave over my driveway." Debbie adjusted her glasses and smiled that condescending smile that probably got her slapped in high school. "Well, according to our updated community map, your property boundaries have been revised," she said, pulling out a freshly printed document. "You'll be receiving a bill for $4,200 for this infrastructure improvement, plus $650 monthly maintenance fees going forward." She tapped her aluminum stick on the fresh asphalt for emphasis. "And I'm afraid farm vehicles will no longer be permitted on the community jogging path. You'll need to find an alternative route to your garage." That's when it hit me. My truck was parked in the garage, and this new jogging path was the only way in or out. These people had effectively trapped my vehicle and were demanding thousands of dollars for the privilege. I watched the workers install a second sign that read, "Community property trespassers will be prosecuted," right next to my garage door. The audacity was breathtaking. Debbie reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a citation book like she was some kind of police officer. "Speaking of vehicles," I'm issuing you a $400 citation for improper vehicle storage on community property," she said, scribbling on the carbon paper. "Your truck will need to be moved immediately." I stood there for a moment, breathing in the morning air and listening to my grandfather's voice in my head. He'd always told me that a man's property was sacred, and anyone who tried to take it was nothing but a common thief with fancy paperwork. I touched the brim of his old cap and felt that familiar surge of Hayes family stubbornness. "Lady, you just made the biggest mistake of your life," I said. Quietly, "This isn't over." Debbie laughed like I told her a funny joke. "Mr. Hayes, the HOA has full legal authority here. I suggest you accept the new reality and cooperate with community standards." She turned to walk away, then paused and looked back. "Oh, and if you have any concerns, you can submit them in writing to the HOA board. We meet once a month and will consider your input during the public comment period." That evening I sat in my garage looking at my grandfather's 3 vintage tractors. Big Blue, a 1962 Ford 4000 that could pull a house off its foundation. Green Machine, a 1968 John Deere 3020 that ran like a Swiss watch. And Red Beast, a 1971 International 574 that sounded like rolling thunder when it fired up. These weren't just farm equipment. To me, they were family heirlooms, pieces of American history that my grandfather had restored with his own hands. Now some wannabe HOA dictator wanted to tell me where I could and couldn't drive them. I put my hand on Big Blue's steering wheel and could almost feel my grandfather's presence. Tomorrow, Debbie Aston was going to learn what happens when you mess with a Hayes family tradition. I spent Wednesday morning on the phone with my old college buddy, Bob Henderson, who happened to be the best property lawyer in 3 counties. "Colton, this smells like fraud." "From here," Bob said after I explained the situation. "Real HOA jurisdictions don't work that way. You can't just declare someone's property under your control and start paving roads." He'd handled dozens of HOA disputes over the years, and this one had all the red flags of a power-hungry wannabe trying to flex authority she didn't actually have. "Send me your original property papers, and I'll review everything. But from what you're telling me, this woman is way out of line. My neighbor Frank Miller stopped by around lunchtime with information that made my blood boil. Frank had lived next door for 40 years and witnessed every property transaction in the area. Son, I've been watching that woman's operation and something stinks worse than a dead skunk in July," he said, adjusting his weathered baseball cap. "That map she's waving around is pure fiction. Your grandfather's land was never part of any HOA, and I've got the old surveys to prove it." Frank pulled out a folder thick with documents he'd collected over the decades that Debbie character has been sniffing around rural properties for months, targeting folks she thinks won't fight back. She tried the same thing with the widow Peterson last year, but backed down when Peterson's son threatened to call the sheriff by afternoon. I was getting a clearer picture of who I was dealing with. Frank's research revealed that Debbie Aston was a 3-time divorce who'd lost her house to foreclosure. 2 years ago, she was currently living in a double wide trailer with her elderly mother in the mobile home section of the legitimate HOA development down the road. The woman had no real authority, no legal standing, and apparently no shame about lying to get what she wanted. She's jealous of your 5 acres. Colton Frank explained that ranch represents everything she lost when her life fell apart. Taking it piece by piece makes her feel powerful again. While I was digesting this information, Debbie decided to escalate the situation around 3 Kuri. A county code enforcement officer showed up at my door with a clipboard and a bad attitude. "Mr. Hayes, we've received an anonymous complaint about unauthorized agricultural operations in a residential zone," he announced. I knew exactly who'd made that anonymous complaint. but I let him look around anyway. After 20 minutes of searching, he found nothing but well-maintained vintage tractors in a clean garage. "Everything looks fine here," he admitted. "Whoever called this in was wasting my time, but the message was clear. Debbie was willing to drag government officials into her personal vendetta. Thursday morning brought another escalation. I woke up to find Debbie standing in my driveway with a different citation book. "This one bright yellow, Mr. Hayes, I'm issuing you a $300 fine for unsafe farm equipment storage that threatens community safety," she announced. "These antique tractors pose a hazard to children and joggers using the community." Path, I'd had enough of her games. "Lady, those tractors are maintained better than most cars on the road, and they're stored on my private property," I said. "You have no authority to cite me for anything." Debbie smiled that infuriating smile and clicked her pen. "The HOA has full enforcement powers within community boundaries. Mr. Hayes, if you don't like it, you can take it up with the county." Well, that's when I decided to stop playing defense and go on the offensive. I spent Thursday afternoon servicing all 3 tractors, changing oil, checking hydraulics, and making sure every engine ran perfectly. The ritual of maintenance helped me think clearly about my next move. Each tractor had its own personality and purpose. Big Blue was the heavy hitter designed for serious work that required raw power. Green Machine was the precision tool perfect for delicate operations that needed finesse. Red Beast was the intimidator, loud enough to wake the dead and tough enough to work through anything. Together they represented 3 generations of American engineering excellence, and they were about to teach Debbie Aston a lesson in respect. I fired up each engine one by one, letting them idle in the garage while I planned my strategy. The sound of diesel engines echoing off the garage walls was music to my ears, but I noticed it had a different effect on Debbie. She appeared at her trailer window across the field, watching my garage with binoculars, like some kind of neighborhood spy. Good, let her wonder what I was planning. The psychological warfare had begun, and she didn't even realize it. Yet every morning that week I started those engines at exactly 60 m and let them run for 10 minutes, just long enough to announce that the hay ranch was still operational. And under new management, Bob called Friday morning with news that confirmed my suspicions. "Colleton, I've reviewed your grandfather's property papers, and that woman has 0 legal authority over your land." He said her HOA jurisdiction claim is completely fabricated. "The real HOA down the road has never claimed your property, and county records show your ranch boundaries exactly as they were in 1987. He paused for emphasis. "What she's doing is harassment, at minimum possibly fraud. If she tries to collect those fees, you've got every right to remove that asphalt from your property and restore your original driveway." That was exactly what I wanted to hear, but I had a better idea brewing that night. I sat on the porch, staring into the dark, turning Frank's folder of documents over and over in my lap. A part of me, the tired part, almost wanted to let it go, file a quiet report, let the legal process crawl forward, and hope it all resolved itself. But then I looked over at the garage and saw Big Blue's silhouette under the floodlight. My grandfather's cap was still hanging on the wall hook by the door. I walked over, picked it up, and felt the weight of it in my hands. That old thing had seen more sunrises than Debbie had bad ideas, and suddenly I remembered his words, "You don't inherit land, boy, you inherit the fight to keep it." Friday afternoon, Debbie delivered her ultimate ultimatum. She marched up to my garage with her clipboard and aluminum stick, flanked by 2 of the same workers who'd paved my driveway. "Mr. Hayes, you have 48 hours to remove all farm equipment from the premises or the HOA will take legal action," she announced. "Community standards require immediate compliance with vehicle restrictions." I looked at her, standing there in her thrift store blazer, trying to intimidate me with fake authority, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost, Debbie. You just made this a whole lot easier for me, I said, touching the brim of my grandfather's cap. Saturday morning, you're going to see exactly what Hayes family compliance looks like. Saturday morning at 6 daily, sharp. I fired up Big Blue, and the sound of that Ford diesel echoing across the countryside was like a battle horn announcing the beginning of war. The engine roared to life with a deep, throaty rumble that shook the garage walls and sent vibrations. Through the ground, I let it warm up for 5 minutes while I put on my grandfather's cap and work gloves, feeling his spirit guiding my hands through the garage window. I could see lights coming on in houses across the neighborhood as folks woke up to the sound of vintage American machinery preparing for action. This wasn't just about moving tractors. This was about making a statement that would be heard from here to the county line. Green Machine started up next, adding its higher-pitched John Deere Song to the Morning Symphony. The two engines created a harmony of power that spoke to something deep in my soul, the same feeling my grandfather must have felt when he worked this land decades ago. I climbed into Big Blue's driver's seat and wrapped my hands around the steering wheel that had guided countless hours of honest work. The vinyl seat was cracked from age, but still comfortable. Worn smooth by years of use, through the windshield I could see my target, that black asphalt ribbon that had no business crossing Hayes family property. It was time to reclaim what was mine. Red Beast fired up with a roar that could wake the dead. 3 counties over the International's exhaust stack belched black smoke into the morning air as the engine settled into its characteristic rumble. Now I had all 3 machines running in perfect harmony, creating a sound that announced to the world that the Hayes Ranch was back in business. I put Big Blue in gear and slowly rolled out of the garage, feeling the weight and power of 15 tons of vintage steel. Responding to my command, the tractor moved with the deliberate confidence of a machine built to last forever, crossing onto the asphalt with a satisfying crunch as the steel tracks met the smooth surface. I positioned Big Blue directly in the center of the so-called jogging path, blocking it completely from one property line to the other. The blue paint gleamed in the morning sun, and the Ford emblem on the hood caught the light like a badge of honor. From the driver's seat, I could see the entire neighborhood waking up to this spectacle, faces appearing in windows and folks stepping onto their porches to watch the show. This wasn't just about parking a tractor. This was about drawing a line in the sand and daring anyone to cross it. I climbed down and fired up Green Machine, driving it out to join its partner in what was rapidly becoming the most epic traffic jam in county history. Green Machine took its position alongside Big Blue, the 2 tractors standing side by side like sentinels guarding the gate to my property. The John Deere's green paint contrasted beautifully with the Ford's blue, creating a patriotic display that would have made my grandfather proud. I could hear car doors slamming and voices carrying across the morning air as neighbors gathered to witness this mechanical mutiny. Some were laughing, others were taking pictures, but everyone was paying attention. That's exactly what I wanted. Red Beast completed the formation, rolling into position with the authority of a machine that had never backed down from a fight in its 50-year history. The 3 tractors formed a perfect blockade across the entire width of the asphalt path, creating what I like to think of as the world's most beautiful traffic jam. I climbed down from Red Beast and walked to my truck, retrieving a hand-painted sign I'd prepared the night before. Hayes Ranch Tractor Parking Permanent Residence. It read, in bold black letters, I mounted it on a fence post right next to the HOA's jogging path sign, creating a delicious contrast between their fake authority and my genuine property rights. The irony was perfect. They wanted to control my driveway, so I'd given them a permanent display of exactly what they were trying to regulate. By 7:30, I had quite an audience gathering. Neighbours were walking over with coffee cups in hand, kids were pointing and laughing at the spectacle, and more than a few folks were taking pictures to share with friends. The morning joggers who actually used the path were discovering that their route had been permanently altered by 15 tons of vintage farm equipment. Some seemed annoyed, but most were amused by the creative solution to an obvious property dispute way to stick it to the HOA. Called out Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down. She'd been fighting her own battles with overzealous homeowner associations for years, and clearly appreciated a good rebellion. When she saw one, that's when Debbie Ruston arrived on the scene, driving up in her dented Honda Civic. With the speed of someone who just discovered their house was on fire, she slammed the car door hard enough to rattle the windows and marched toward my tractor formation with her clipboard clutched like a weapon. Her face was red as a tomato, and those reading glasses were sliding down her nose as she worked herself into a righteous fury. "Mr. Hayes," she shrieked, loud enough to be heard in the next county, "you cannot block community property with these farm machines." In the way she said farm machines made it sound like I'd parked a herd of diseased cattle in her living room. I was sitting comfortably in Big Blue's driver's seat, wearing my grandfather's cap and enjoying the morning show. "Good morning, Debbie," I called out cheerfully, "just exercising my property rights on my land according to the original 1987 survey that Bob Henderson reviewed." I gestured toward the tractors with obvious pride. "Meet Big Blue, Green Machine and Red Beast. They'll be permanent residents of this parking area from now on." Debbie's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water as she tried to process what was happening. Her carefully constructed authority was crumbling in real time, and everyone in the neighborhood was watching it happen. Monday morning brought Debbie's most desperate and dirty move yet. At 16th a.m. I was awakened by the sound of police sirens and heavy boots on my front porch. Through the window, I saw 3 county sheriff's deputies and a detective standing there with official paperwork. "Mr. Hayes, we have a search warrant based on reports of suspicious drug activity at this address." The lead officer announced. My heart sank as I realized what Debbie had done. She'd filed a false police report claiming she'd witnessed suspicious traffic and drug activity at my ranch. The officers were professional but thorough, searching my garage, house and property for over an hour while neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle. Of course, they found nothing but vintage tractors, BBQ supplies, and the cleanest garage in 3 counties. "Sir, whoever reported this was either mistaken or deliberately wasting our time," the detective said, as they prepared to leave. "Everything here is obviously legitimate, but the damage was done. My neighbors had watched police search my property like I was some kind of criminal, and I knew exactly who was responsible." Debbie had crossed a line that morning. Moving from petty harassment into criminal territory, filing a false police report was a serious offense, and she just handed me the perfect ammunition. For my counterattack, I decided it was time to turn this local dispute into a community event. I called everyone I knew and put the word out. Hayes Ranch was hosting a tractor appreciation BBQ on Saturday, and everyone was invited to come see the vintage equipment collection and hear the real story about the property dispute. I hired a local BBQ food truck, ordered enough supplies to feed a small army, and prepared to turn Debbie's harassment campaign into the best community gathering Neighborhood had seen in years if she wanted to play dirty, I'd show her how to play smart. Saturday morning dawned clear and beautiful, perfect weather for an outdoor event by 10KA. My property was bustling with activity as neighbors, friends, and curious strangers arrived to see the famous tractor blockade that had become local legend. The 3 vintage machines sat gleaming in the morning sun, freshly washed and polished. For their starring role, kids climbed on the tractors while their parents took pictures, and everyone wanted to hear the story of how a simple property dispute had turned into the most entertaining neighborhood drama in recent memory. The local TV news crew arrived around 11, having heard about the David versus Goliath story playing out in our rural community. That's when Debbie made her grand entrance, marching onto my property with a fresh stack of legal papers and 2 uncomfortable-looking men in cheap suits who she claimed were HOA enforcement officers. "This is an illegal gathering on community property," she announced to the crowd of nearly 80 people. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately or face trespassing charges." The crowd turned to stare at her with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Here was this woman in her thrift store blazer trying to shut down a peaceful community BBQ with fake legal papers and imaginary authority. It was like watching someone try to stop the tide with a teaspoon. The news reporter, a sharp young woman named Lisa Martinez from Channel 7, immediately recognized the entertainment value of the situation. "Ma'am, can you explain your legal authority to shut down this private property event?" she asked, shoving a microphone in Debbie's face. Debbie's response was a masterclass in self-destruction. "The HOA has full enforcement powers in this community," she declared. "This man is violating multiple ordinances and community standards." Lisa pressed for details, asking to see documentation of this authority, and Debbie began to unravel. In real time, her voice got higher, her face got redder, and her claims got more outrageous with each passing minute. That's when Frank Miller stepped forward with a manila folder full of historical documents. "Miss Ruston, I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've got the property records to prove that everything you've said is a lie," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This ranch was never part of any HOA, and you have no more authority here than my neighbor's dog." He opened the folder and began reading from official county documents that clearly established the property boundaries. "Mr. Hayes owns this land, fair and square." According to legal documents dating back to 1987, Bob Henderson chose that moment to make his dramatic entrance, arriving with a briefcase full of legal documents and the confidence of a man who'd won 90% of his property. "Dispute cases, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bob Henderson, Mr. Hayes' attorney, and I'm here to set the record straight," he announced to the crowd. "Mrs. Ruston has been operating under completely fabricated authority. The real HOA down the road has never claimed jurisdiction over this property, and county records clearly show these boundaries." He pulled out enlarged copies of the original survey maps and held them up for everyone to see. What we have here is a classic case of harassment by someone with no legal standing whatsoever. Debbie's reaction to this public exposure was spectacular in its complete meltdown. She began screaming about conspiracies and cover-ups, waving her clipboard like a battle flag, while demanding that someone arrest everyone at the gathering. In her fury, she actually climbed onto Big Blue's hood and began jumping up and down, trying to damage the tractor. While shrieking about property rights, Frank quickly pulled out his phone and recorded the entire display, capturing every moment of her breakdown for posterity. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Debbie destroyed any remaining credibility she might have had, transforming herself from neighborhood nuisance into local laughings and yet Watching her flail around on that tractor like a furious toddler at a rodeo, I felt something unexpected relief, not for me, but for everyone she'd bullied into silence for years. It was as if the weight of her fake authority had cracked under the pressure of truth, and we were all finally breathing fresh air. I looked around and saw neighbors smiling, strangers, nodding kids, laughing like they knew something important had just happened. That moment wasn't just a meltdown, it was a collective exhale. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like ours again. The TV news crew captured every second of the meltdown, creating footage that would be viewed thousands of times over the following weeks. Lisa Martinez provided live commentary as Debbie continued her tantrum, explaining to viewers how a simple property dispute had revealed a pattern of harassment and fraud that affected multiple residents. By the time Debbie finally exhausted herself and stormed off the property, she'd become the perfect villain in a story that resonated with anyone who'd ever dealt with petty bureaucrats and power-hungry officials. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause as she drove away, and I knew the war was effectively over. Tuesday morning brought sweet vindication when county officials arrived to investigate Debbie's false police report and fraudulent HOA. Claims detective Sarah Morrison, a no-nonsense investigator with 20 years of experience, had reviewed all the evidence and reached some very clear conclusions. Mr. Hayes, Miss Ruston has been charged with filing false police reports, harassment, and attempting to collect fees under fraudulent authority. She explained, "We've also discovered she tried similar schemes in 2 other counties before. Moving here, the charges carried potential jail time and substantial fines, meaning Debbie's reign of terror was officially over. The real HOA board from the legitimate development down the road sent representatives to apologize for the confusion and distance themselves from Debbie's actions. We want to make it absolutely clear that Miss Ruston never had any authority to speak for our organization. Board President Michael Chen explained her claims about jurisdiction over your property were completely fabricated. They offered to help with the cost of removing the illegal asphalt and restoring my original driveway, though I had other plans. For dealing with that particular problem, Wednesday became Demolition Day, and half the neighborhood showed up to help remove the offending pavement. What surprised me most wasn't who showed up, it was how many. Frank brought his grandson, a 15-year-old. With more grit than most grown men, the Peterson family brought iced lemonade and enough sandwiches to feed a crew. Even old man Donnelly, who hadn't left his porch in 3 years, hobbled over with a crowbar and declared, "Ain't missing this for the world." At one point, a neighbor brought a Bluetooth speaker and started blasting Johnny Cash while the tractors tore up asphalt. It wasn't just demolition, it was a party, a revolt. The sound of concrete cracking beneath tractor tires felt like freedom. One slab at a time, I fired up Big Blue and used its hydraulic loader to break up chunks of asphalt, while neighbors hauled debris to a rented dumpster. The work was hard but satisfying, like performing surgery to remove a cancer from my grandfather's. Land kids helped sweep gravel while their parents shared stories of their own HOA battles, creating a sense of community solidarity that had been missing from our neighborhood for years. By afternoon, we'd removed every trace of Debbie's improvement and restored the original dirt road exactly as my grandfather had built it. The community effort revealed something unexpected during the cleanup process. Frank's old survey maps showed that the property line actually extended 10 feet further than I'd thought, meaning part of what the HOA considered common area actually belonged to the Hayes Ranch. The irony was perfect. Debbie had been trespassing on my land for months while accusing me of violating community property. Bob Henderson immediately filed paperwork to establish the correct boundaries and submitted a bill to the HOA for unauthorized use of my land. "She owes you rent money, Colton," he said, with obvious satisfaction. Thursday brought news that Debbie had been evicted from her trailer for non-payment of rent, apparently spending her grocery money on fake legal documents and citation books her elderly mother embarrassed by. The public humiliation had kicked her out and refused to post bail when Debbie was arrested for violating the restraining order I'd obtained. The woman who'd tried to control my property now had no property of her own, living in her Honda Civic, and facing criminal charges that could land her in county jail for up to 6 months. The media attention from the BBQ incident had unexpected benefits for my little corner of the world. Channel 7's story about the tractor blockade went viral locally, inspiring other property owners to stand up to HOA overreach in their own neighborhoods. I started getting calls from folks dealing with similar harassment, asking for advice about fighting back against petty bureaucrats and power-hungry officials. The Hayes Ranch had become a symbol of individual property rights, and my grandfather's vintage tractors were the unlikely heroes of a movement that was spreading across rural communities. By Friday, the transformation was complete. My original dirt road was restored, the 3 tractors stood proudly in their garage, and peace had returned to the neighborhood. Property values actually increased due to the positive publicity, and several families mentioned they were considering moving to our area, specifically because of the strong community spirit they'd witnessed. The local tourism board even inquired about adding the famous tractor ranch to their rural heritage trail, turning Debbie's harassment campaign into an unexpected economic opportunity. The legal resolution came swiftly once the evidence was compiled. Debbie pleaded guilty to multiple charges in exchange for reduced sentence of 6 months probation, community service, and restitution payments to me and several other neighbors she'd harassed. She was also required to stay at least 500 FT away from my property and prohibited from claiming any HOA authority anywhere in the county. The judge's comments during sentencing made it clear that this kind of harassment would not be tolerated in his courtroom, setting a precedent that would protect other property owners from similar schemes. The month following Debbie's legal downfall brought opportunities I never could have imagined. The local news story had been picked up by regional networks, and suddenly everyone wanted to hear about the tractor man who stood up to HOA tyranny. I received interview requests from farm magazines, property rights organizations, and even a documentary filmmaker who wanted to feature the Hayes Ranch in a film about American land ownership battles. My quiet rural life had become a platform for something much bigger than a simple property dispute. The business opportunities were even more surprising. Visitors began showing up on weekends asking to see the famous tractors and hear the story. Firsthand, I started charging $10 per person for tours, explaining the history of the machines and the principles of property rights that my grandfather had taught me within a month. I was hosting over 200 visitors every weekend, turning what had started as a harassment campaign into a legitimate tourism business. The 3 tractors that Debbie had tried to ban became the stars of their own show, My Vintage Tractor Restoration. Hobby evolved into a serious business as word spread about the quality of my work. What started with one guy offering to pay for an engine polish turned into a waiting list of restoration jobs booked out for the next 6 months. Local suppliers started calling to offer discounted parts just for the chance to be associated with the Hayes brand. A high school auto class even asked if they could send students to intern at the shop, said they wanted to learn real American mechanics. I built a small training shed beside the garage and bought 2 new workbenches. It felt like my grandfather's spirit was pushing this forward, not just fixing up old steel, but fixing something deeper in the heart of this town. Orders started coming in from collectors across 3 states who wanted their own vintage machines restored to original condition. I hired 2 local mechanics and expanded the garage to accommodate the growing workload. what had started as a passion project to honor my grandfather's memory became a thriving enterprise that employed local workers and brought money into our rural community. The romantic subplot of my life took an unexpected turn when I met Sarah Chen, a veterinarian who'd heard about the tractor story and stopped by. To see the ranch, she immediately fell in love with the rural lifestyle and appreciated the values that my grandfather had passed down to me, unlike my ex-wife who'd hated everything about country living. Sarah understood that the land and the tractors represented something deeper than mere property or machinery. They were symbols of independence, hard work, and the American dream that had been passed down through generations. Debbie's attempts at comeback were pathetic and short-lived. She tried, starting a new organization called Citizens for Community Standards, but couldn't find a single neighbor willing to join her crusade. Her social media posts about being victimized by tractor terrorism were met with ridicule and mockery from people who'd witnessed her public meltdown. Even her own mother refused to have anything to do with her after the embarrassment she'd brought to the family. Name the woman who'd once strutted around with fake authority, now couldn't show her face anywhere in the county without being recognized as the infamous HOA Karen. The success story attracted attention from local politicians who wanted to be associated with the feel-good narrative of individual rights triumphing over bureaucratic overreach. The county commissioner visited the ranch and posed for pictures with the tractors, using the photo opportunity to announce new protections for rural property owners. State representatives began discussing legislation that would prevent future HOA harassment campaigns and establish clear penalties for fraudulent authority. Claims my little property dispute had sparked a movement that was making real changes in state law. By the end of summer, the Hayes Ranch had become a legitimate tourist destination featured in rural heritage guides and weekend travel recommendations. I'd expanded the operation to include a small gift. Shop selling. Don't Pave My Dreams t-shirts and miniature tractors, with proceeds supporting a scholarship fund for agricultural students at the local community college. The property that Debbie had tried to control was now generating more revenue and positive attention than she could have imagined. In her wildest power fantasies, the wedding planning began in earnest when Sarah accepted my proposal. During a sunset tractor ride around the property, we decided to hold the ceremony right here. On the ranch, between the 3 vintage tractors that had started this whole adventure, the local media was already asking about covering the tractor wedding, and we were considering making it a community celebration that would benefit local charities. My grandfather would have loved seeing his land become the foundation for a new Hayes family generation, and I could almost feel his approval every time I put on his old cap. The phone call that changed everything came on a crisp October morning. While I was working in the garage, Lisa Martinez from Channel 7 was on the line with news that took my breath away. "Colton, good morning. America wants to interview you about the tractor story. They're calling it a perfect example of American ingenuity and individual rights." The national morning show had heard about the Hayes Ranch through their local affiliate network and wanted to feature the story as an inspirational segment about standing up to bullies and bureaucrats. Within a week, I found myself sitting in front of cameras talking to millions of viewers about property rights, vintage tractors, and the importance of defending what your family built. The television appearance opened doors I never knew existed. Publishers reached out about writing a book. Speaking bureaus wanted to book me for events, and other HOA victims from across the country began contacting me for advice about fighting their own battles. I realized that what had started as a personal property dispute had become something much larger, a symbol of hope for anyone dealing with petty officials who'd forgotten that authority comes from the people, not from clipboards and fake badges. The Hayes Ranch had become a destination for people seeking inspiration. To stand up for their own rights, the wedding took place on a perfect November afternoon, with Sarah walking down an aisle between Big Blue and Green Machine, while Red Beast provided the backdrop for our vows. Over 300 guests attended, including neighbors, media representatives, and people who'd traveled hundreds of miles to witness the ceremony that celebrated not just our union, but the victory of principle over bureaucracy. The local news covered it as a human interest story, and the images of a bride and groom exchanging vows between vintage tractors became an internet sensation that perfectly captured the unique spirit of rural American values. The business continued to grow beyond anything I'd imagine possible. The tractor restoration shop was booked solid. For the next 18 months, the weekend tours were consistently sold out, and merchandise sales were supporting scholarship programs at 3 different agricultural colleges. I'd hired 8 local workers, purchased the adjacent 10-acre property, and established the Hayes Heritage Foundation to preserve rural traditions and support young farmers. What had started as a hobby was now a multi-seated enterprise that was making a real difference in people's lives. Debbie's final fate was both pathetic and fitting, unable to find employment anywhere in the region due to her criminal record and reputation. She'd moved to another state and was reportedly living in a subsidized apartment complex with, ironically, strict HOA rules that governed everything from parking to flower pot placement. The woman who'd tried to control everyone else's property now had to ask permission to hang a wreath on her own door. Frank Miller, who had been instrumental in exposing her fraud, was elected as the new president of the legitimate HOA, bringing fair and transparent leadership to the organization. The documentary paved over a story of property rights, premiered at several film festivals, and was eventually picked up by a streaming service for national distribution. The film used the Hayes Ranch story as a lens to examine larger issues of property rights, government overreach, and the importance of community solidarity in fighting bullies. My grandfather's vintage tractors became symbols of American resilience and the idea that ordinary people could stand up to authority when that authority was being abused. Schools began showing the documentary in civics classes as an example of how individual action could create positive change. The legal precedent established by Debbie's prosecution had far-reaching effects beyond our local community. Other counties began investigating similar HOA fraud schemes, and state legislation was passed requiring HOA boards to provide clear documentation of their authority before taking any enforcement actions. The Hayes Standard became legal shorthand for the principle that property rights couldn't be violated by fake authority, no matter how official it appeared. On the surface, lawyers across the region began using our case as a template for fighting similar harassment campaigns. Sarah and I celebrated our first anniversary by announcing that she was pregnant with the next generation of Hayes family members who would grow up on the ranch. We'd expanded the property to 50 acres, established a working farm that supplied local restaurants, and created an educational center that taught children about agriculture mechanics and the importance of standing up for what's right. The land that my grandfather had worked with his hands was now supporting dozens of families and inspiring thousands of visitors who came to see where one man's refusal to be bullied had sparked a movement. Every morning I put on my grandfather's cap and walk out to see the 3 tractors that changed my life in our community, Big Blue Green Machine and Red Beast, sit in their place of honor, no longer just vintage farm equipment, but symbols of the principle that property rights are sacred and that ordinary people have the power to defeat bullies when they stand together. The dirt road that Debbie tried to steal flows beneath my feet exactly as my grandfather built it, connecting the past to the future and proving that some things are worth fighting for. The Hay Ranch stands as a testament to the idea that you should never let anyone pave over your dreams, no matter how official their clipboard looks. What started as a simple property dispute became a story about the power of community, the importance of standing up to bullies, and the enduring strength of American values. Comment below and share your own HOA horror stories, because together we can make sure that what happened to Debbie Ruston becomes the standard response to anyone who tries to abuse authority they don't actually have. Remember, don't let anyone pave over your dreams, and never underestimate the power of vintage American steel.